Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Collitz. I will be presenting on the Restoration Barometer. I would like to take this moment to extensively thank the team for their hard work and dedication throughout the semester. It's been a pleasure working with all of you, and also to our faculty advisor, Professor Sarah Jossam, for all of her commitment, advice, and support throughout the project. We are currently in the 6th extinction of planet Earth. Over 75% of the Earth's land has been altered or degraded due to human activities. This has led to the loss of biodiversity, and it is resulting in the Earth's inability to continue to produce clean air, water, and food for us. To really emphasize the need for ecosystem restoration, the UN has declared the next 10 years the decade of restoration to try to really encourage and incentivize governments to prioritize ecosystem restoration. And this is where our client fits in. The IUCN, or International Union for the Conservation of Nature, is known as the global authority on conserving nature. Most of you will probably be familiar with them through their red list of endangered and threatened species. In 2011, they created the Bond Challenge to incentivize forest restoration. However, due to the need for ecosystems beyond forests to be restored, the Bond Challenge has been expanded to develop the Restoration Barometer, and this will be used to scale up global restoration efforts. So this is a snapshot of the barometer. This shows what governments have been pledging and working towards restoring. So we can see Brazil here had committed 12 million hectares of nature to be, or land to be restored, and currently they are underway with 9.4 million of these hectares. We can also see the amount in dollars that's been invested into restoration efforts, the tons of carbon sequestered as a result of these efforts, as well as the jobs that have been created in the economy. As I mentioned before, the barometer has been scaled up to track the progress across 8 ecosystems, being forests, farmlands, grasslands, rivers, deserts and semi-deserts, mangroves and coasts, peatlands, and urban areas. The barometer measures the success of restoration projects by looking at both the actions and the impact taken by governments. On the actions, governments start off by pledging an amount to be restored and developing policies for these restoration efforts. We then look at the funding that the governments are committing, technical planning going into restoration projects, as well as monitoring systems. And then on the impact side, we can see the area of land that's been restored, the impact this has on the climate measured through carbon sequestered, the impact it has on biodiversity with a special focus on threatened and endangered species, and then the impact it has on the economy of that country, and this is used through jobs created. Our project has focused on 2 of these indicators, which would have the biggest impact in helping IUCN as well as governments. So firstly, we've looked at policies, and then on the action side and on the impact side, we've been looking at climate. So going into policies, we developed a policy tool that will support robust restoration in 2 ways. Firstly, through designing a methodology to evaluate policy progress towards pledges made by governments. And then secondly, to help identify recommendations for policy interventions. So what is this policy assessment tool? Firstly, we researched existing restoration policies and global best practices and used this to establish 10 essential design criteria. For example, looking at, is there knowledge and capability sharing through these policies? Is there land acquisition involved? And then using these design criteria, we developed 32 questions to determine policy completeness. What this could be used for is either a government who is developing a restoration policy could answer these 32 questions, and by answering the questions, design a complete policy. It could also be used to evaluate existing policies to see how complete they are. This tool was then applied to 6 of the Bond Challenge pilot countries and used to both assess these countries' completeness of tools, but also refine the tool to make sure that it is applicable across multiple contexts. And we have 3 key takeaways from doing this pilot. Firstly, there is minimal transparency of funding and restoration policies. Second, there is a limited implementation plans and protocols. So while governments have been dedicating and committing to doing large-scale restorations, there seems to be a lacking of detail on the implementation plans for this. And then finally, as always, it's important to understand the governance context. This goes in assessing policies in that country and understanding the rationale behind government actions. We also conducted a case study of Bangladesh, looking at the 4 action items the government has been doing in their restoration efforts. And we established 2 key takeaways that can be applied globally for restoration. Firstly, it's really important to embed a co-management model into policies. This means that local communities who are operating within these ecosystems being restored receive the autonomy and work with the government in restoring them, and also receive the benefits from this restoration instead of the benefits going back to a centralized government. And secondly, it's important to integrate restoration into existing priorities. So for a lot of low-income countries, they have other pressing priorities that are important, such as healthcare and social security. And so trying to integrate restoration into these priorities will ensure that both short and long-term priorities can be met of these governments. The second area that we looked at is climate. And so climate is looking at measuring carbon impacts of restoration interventions. So firstly, we identified trends in each ecosystem through extensive literature review. And then we created a database of tools available to measure the carbon impact of each ecosystem's restoration. So for this database, we had a criteria for including different tools into the database. Firstly, the tool needed to be recently developed or updated to ensure that the latest science was being used. Secondly, it needs to provide measurements in compliance with IPCC data tiers, and this is used for 2 reasons. Firstly, it ensures that the measurement is reliable and can be used universally, but also it means that governments can use this restoration data as part of their NDCs within the Paris Agreement. And finally, it needs to be open sourced and accessible so that governments around the world can use it. In our literature review, we included a review of some of these tools from the database, and these were tools that were either new to the IUCN or they were widely applicable across multiple ecosystems. We again have 3 key takeaways from this database. Clear scientific restoration priorities exist. This can be seen through the fact that there are some tools and ecosystems that have extensive research and tools developed, whereas other ecosystems are lacking. There is increased applicability and overlap. Some tools can be used to measure carbon sequestered across multiple ecosystems. And then finally, there is a need for the development of aquatic and desert ecosystem tools. And this is especially important given the role that these ecosystems can play in sequestering carbon. Overall, the findings from our project will aid governments and NGOs to more effectively address restoration globally. Firstly, this will be through improving the monitoring of impact. And this is especially important in aiding low-income countries in securing international funding for restoration projects. Often these countries rely on international donors to help with these projects, and so having reliable measurement metrics can increase funding in the future. Secondly, it is streamlining policy development and analysis within the barometer, and this is especially important for the IUCN, so that when they're engaging with governments on the progress that they're making, they have a centralized place where they can look at the work these governments have been doing. And finally, this is assisting the global community in achieving the goal of 350 million hectares of restoration by 2030. Thank you very much, and I will take any questions.
Great presentation, Amy. I was just curious, based off of your 10 design criteria and the different elements that you were talking about, based off the research that your team did, how far do you feel like most of these countries are from reaching those goals? Does it seem like they're making progress towards them? Are they pretty much lacking across the board? Just what were you seeing in terms of the range?
Sure. So we were mainly assessing the completeness of policies because of the local context needed to assess different countries. We didn't feel like we had the knowledge to kind of say country X is super close or super far away from their goals. But it was quite interesting to see some countries had kind of policies that met all of the design criteria. There were other countries where the funding, for instance, wasn't very clear in the policies. I don't know if the policy team would like to jump in here, but I think it was kind of varying across the board.
Yeah, to follow that up, the 10 criteria aren't necessarily goals, but they are more of a framework to create a very complete and comprehensive restoration regime. And so it was used as a way to identify possible gaps in certain countries' approaches to restoration. And then in turn, the tool could be able to inform like a policy intervention for that country. But for a lot of the research to develop that criteria, we did an extensive literature review. But then when we were piloting it, we only looked at those 5 pilot countries. So we can only really speak to just those 5, which we can give more detail after the presentation if you like.
You had mentioned that like one of the critical keys to success for restoration was tying it to other priorities that occur, especially in developing countries where like questions about economic development and like social security and healthcare are more prominent. I was wondering if you could give a couple more examples, because like obviously on the dashboard they have jobs created, but that seems like a very limited metric of like potential economic benefit or like just general human benefit, right?
Sorry, so are you asking what are the benefits of restoration, or how should it be integrated into countries?
Like what are the like, well, I kind of made an assumption that like there are additional benefits to restoration that can be tied into these policy priorities that countries are interested in, that are higher priority than restoration and can make restoration a good sell, right? So like, could you give some examples of what that looks like and how you convince countries that this is a worthy priority?
So I think firstly, the metric that's used, which is jobs created, comes directly from the barometer and the IUCN. So we weren't really doing a lot of research into the other benefits in terms of updating that metric. But I think just from experience that I have, if you're living in a community where their ecosystem is being degraded, you see those benefits and the detrimental side of that firsthand on the ground. So if you have a desert that's continuously expanding, or you have wetlands that are degrading, that impacts the species in the area, which has a knock-on effect of air quality, water quality, just extensive things. Then looking at sea level rises, and mangroves play a critical role in kind of decreasing the impact of disasters like that. So I think overall, at least in our research, it doesn't seem like countries are saying that restoration is not a priority, but it's just difficult to, when you have limited funding, take all of your funding away from healthcare, which is critical in a lot of countries that don't have the money like the global north countries do, to say we're not going to put money into healthcare, but we're going to just put all of it into restoration. So I think it's just governments have to try to find a way to find the funding in a way that doesn't take away from other pressing needs, as opposed to convincing them that they need to do that.
Many restoration projects require like a long-term commitment of funding, but as you see, there's a lot of like a very high opportunity cost for developing countries. So, like, would there be any other monitoring tools to like keep the track on the restoration process to follow the metrics?
Sure, Stephen would like to take that question.
Thanks. Yeah, that sort of does circle back to the policy tool assessment, because one of the criteria was monitoring frameworks. And oftentimes those were a little lacking, either more established or less established in countries. But at this phase, it's more looking at governance. But to your point, restoration is a long-term process. And so member countries and program officers assigned to those countries, or within those countries' governments who are going to be using the tool, are going to be eventually using biophysical data and metrics to then add on and scale up the policy tool. Right now, it's more like governance, but then the idea is it will scale up to include scientific metrics.
And also, just to add to that, sorry, 2 seconds. I think that's where the climate indicator database comes into. So with funding, if it starts to run out in countries, because they can have robust measurement systems, they're able to receive international funding from donors and INGOs who would help kind of bridge that gap.